In 1947, in the high cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, the greatest manuscript discovery in history electrified the world. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written during the period when Christianity was born. Scholars could hardly believe their good fortune. Finally, they hoped, there could be evidence of the historic Jesus. Over 50 years, finding that link has been difficult. Today, there are fresh eyes looking at the ancient parchments, driven by tantalizing clues which are shaping new interpretations of the scrolls. Some say a direct connection to Christianity. Using tools developed for modern forensics, investigators are following leads to new caves that might hold yet more scrolls. Other scholars are reinvestigating the scrolls themselves, using the computer and infrared X-rays to find words that couldn't be seen before. Can the Dead Sea Scrolls still reveal the secrets of Christianity? We're closer than ever to finding out. This is the lowest elevation on Earth, 1,000 feet below sea level, the shores of the Dead Sea. It's dramatic because of the cliffs that rise up sharply. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, in 11 caves dotted in the cliffs, all within a 2-mile distance. This is the 4th cave discovered. And there's an expedition underway, led by this man, Hebrew scholar Robert Eisenman from Long Beach State University. They're using the latest ground-penetrating radar, looking for caves that might have been missed.
Potential is like earth-shattering, if you like. Culturally, historically, if we could find a cave, which is an artificially hollowed-out cave, if they had an overflow of manuscripts or documents, they would have hollowed out a second one or a third one. Maybe we can't see the entrance, so the potential is unimaginable.
It's typical of what the scrolls inspired. Just the thought of discovering new manuscripts that might provide new clues. It's been that way from the first discovery. It's one of the driest places on Earth, barren, except for its history. This is the wilderness mentioned in the Gospels, where Jesus walked. Where John the Baptist spoke of a voice in the wilderness. Where sheep-herders still look for the slightest touch of green grass among the rocks. In 1947, a Bedouin threw a rock into this cave, now called Cave Number 1. It sounded as if the rock hit ceramic, something man-made. Inside, the Bedouin found 10 jars. In one of them were several bundles carefully wrapped in linen. Back in camp, they unrolled a long strip of leather with strange writing on it. The Bedouins knew their find was old, but didn't know how old. Always on the lookout for antiquities lying around the Judean desert, they tried to sell their find to a dealer in Bethlehem, and then Jerusalem. It wasn't hard to find one in the marketplace of the old city. Everything can be found in a bazaar. In Jerusalem, it's often hard to tell old from new, and that was the problem. No one knew the value. Were they fakes? The first dealer's name was Kendo, and he didn't know what he had. He paid the Bedouins $100 for their trouble, and to keep them bringing more. Who could imagine these dirty, tattered lumps represented the greatest manuscript find in history and provided a 2,000-year-old window into the minds of Jews wrestling with religious ideas that were boiling in these streets of Jerusalem. The discovery in 1947 was easy compared to the next 50 years and the struggle to find out what they meant. At the cliff face, the readings are interesting. Their target is an area adjacent to Cave 4, where the most documents were found.
The interesting part about this is we're shooting into the cliff face. This could be a void. It's not the strongest signal we've ever seen for a void.
The small orange box sends radar beams into the mix of gravel, mud, and clay to create a computerized picture of what's inside. Interpretation is everything, except getting a good picture. That requires daring and skill.
We saw a huge empty area on one of the three adjoining fingers next to Cave 4. We're trying to identify exactly which that finger is. And we're trying to see if there's another cave like that. If there is another cave like Cave 4, it would be like the motherlode of all motherlodes for Dead Sea Scroll documents.
Cave 4 sits atop a gravel outcrop, looking down on a wadi, cut by the occasional water from Jerusalem rains. It's tricky to get into. You have to climb down to reach a room some 30 feet long.
This, as you can see, is not a natural cave. It's an artificially hollowed out cave for the purpose of storage of manuscripts. If you look, you'll actually see holes where they probably had shelves, just like a modern library. This was the motherlode of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. There must have been maybe 375,000 fragments of manuscripts in here, just piled up almost to the top, mixed with bat guana, mud, dung, everything you can think of that had piled up over the years.
Cave 4's original discovery team offered to pay the Bedouins 30 piastres for every square centimeter of manuscripts they found. It was the wrong incentive. They ripped the large manuscripts into tiny pieces so they would be paid more. But was this cave a library or a hasty hiding place? James Vanderkam of Notre Dame University is on the team that edits the scrolls.
It's a large enough cave and reading could have been done in it, and it's a comfortable place in which to do something like that in that climate. It's also the closest place to the buildings, and when the buildings were being attacked, or just before that, it's possible that manuscripts were deposited there or tossed there in haste for protection.
The interesting things are the never-before texts. We call those sectarian texts or non-biblical texts. So we have 600 some odd of those, and that's where the exciting drama of interpreting what the scrolls mean came into play. So this is Cave 4, the granddaddy of them all.
We know what the biblical text said. They were copies of Old Testament books. But the sectarian texts were brand new and amounted to background information on the conditions in Judea that led to the rise of Christianity. The first readings hinted at great revelations. That sense of amazement was reflected in the first newsreels about the discovery.
As exciting to man's imagination as outer space has been the recent discovery here in the Holy Land of ancient scrolls tightly rolled up and stored in caves along the shores of the Dead Sea. Scholars are still carefully studying their rich story of a religious community 2,000 years ago whose ideas seem to be the forerunners of Christianity. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are very old with many parts missing and must be treated with great care to preserve them and then studied with all the resources of the human mind.
One of the difficulties in the late 1940s was the confused political situation. The caves were in Jordan before there was a modern Israel. While the documents traveled the back streets of Jerusalem in search of someone who knew their value, the war for Israel's independence broke out. Almost lost in the news of the fighting was an announcement by epigrapher W.F. Albright in Baltimore that put the scrolls in full light. He said they were from the time of the Maccabees, Herod, and therefore Jesus. It was April 12, 1948. The continued fighting in Israel did not make study of the scrolls easy. And as the real value of the scrolls became known, the cliffs around the Discovery Cave were searched for more manuscripts. Although Cave 4 was the mother lode, 11 caves discovered over 10 years contained scrolls, which meant lots of fragments were floating through the antiquities black market. Before they could put the puzzle together, they had to get as many pieces as possible. In 1954, a Syrian religious leader took out an ad in the Wall Street Journal offering 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for sale. The State of Israel purchased them anonymously for $250,000. Were they worth it? In 1954, the State of Israel immediately started plans to build the Shrine of the Book, especially for the Dead Sea Scrolls. They became the identity of the new Israel. The manuscripts contained every book in the Old Testament, with the exception of Esther. A magnificent treasure for Judaism, older even than the Bible as we know it today. If these were the seeds of Judaism, were they also the seeds of Christianity? From the first discovery, everyone knew that a treasure almost as big as the scrolls themselves would be finding one word in them: Jesus. That search would continue more than 50 years. Any investigation is advanced by knowing who is involved. In this case, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and why? The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, remain as mysterious more than 50 years later. Scholars still debate who wrote them. They were written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and clearly reflected the books of the Old Testament. But were they also Christian? That connection was not as easy to make. Working like detectives, the scholars followed the clues and asked logical questions. The caves were near an ancient community on the shore of the Dead Sea named Qumran, especially cave number 4, within shouting distance. Today, the ruins of Qumran silently bake in the sun, but to archaeologists, the stones speak volumes. A radical Jewish group called Essenes are thought to have lived here. The historian Josephus noted Essenes were one of 3 major Jewish groups of the time, along with the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
I think you could call them radical. They did regard themselves as preserving the correct way of life, an older way of life. They believed that they were the ones who correctly interpreted the law of Moses and did so with great care and exactness, and then they attempted to live up to their interpretations of that law.
It was a strict life in obedience to the law of Moses. They believed in ritual baths, total immersion in water 3 to 7 times a day to purify themselves. That was easier said than done. They lived in the desert. So they built an elaborate water system that funneled the rainwater that ran 20 miles from Jerusalem and poured over the cliffs into small aqueducts that ran all the way down to cisterns, where it was saved for their personal use and their ritual baths.
What you see before you is a typical immersion pool. It's a quasi-cistern, but you see it has steps. Steps not only for cleansing, but also steps for people to go down in it and immerse themselves in a ritual purification manner. And if you look at the documents, particularly the community rule, you'll see that this was something that was required of the community members on a daily basis.
They were vegetarians. Women were not allowed. Essenes gave up all their possessions to the community. Archaeologists have found among the ruins evidence some interpret as a scriptorium, where scribes may have copied the sacred writings of the Old Testament. But there were other ideas in the scrolls.
Many are texts that are poetic, like the Psalms, but express the views of this group. A number of them deal with the future, talking about messiahs, the final war, and things like that.
At least one scholar believes the variety of writing within the scrolls means they didn't necessarily originate in Qumran, but were carried here, fearing an attack by the Romans. Norman Gold, University of Chicago.
Now, if we look carefully at the places where they were found, we see they're all positioned in or near wadis, riverbeds, which lead out of Jerusalem. The significant aspect of the history of the Jews of Jerusalem at this time, they were forced to take their scrolls out of the city. They took the secret passages, which Josephus talks about in his Jewish Wars, and hid them in caves and cisterns and so on throughout that territory near the Dead Sea, hoping that the terror would pass and they would pick them up and bring them all back to Jerusalem.
I think it's likely that a number of manuscripts were brought to Qumran from elsewhere. We wouldn't know what those other places were because we don't have any indication in the texts. I don't think it's very likely that they were all brought there from elsewhere or from, let's say, a single national library, if there was one, in Jerusalem and brought to that site.
We cannot make it a major case for Essenes. They were just one small group. Josephus says no more than 4,000 in all of Palestine. And they were a small part of a very large number of Jewish inhabitants of the city.
Although Gold's position is respected, many scholars continue to identify the conservative Jewish writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the radical group, the Essenes, who they believe lived in Qumran.
These scrolls did have Essene characteristics, but that also had an extremely aggressive militancy. Some have said, oh, this is just a collection of documents. These writings are consistent across the board. You never get a compromising document here. You never get an accommodating doctrine here. Never get one approving of Roman rule or foreign rule, of niece marriage, of polygamy, of the king marrying a non-Jewish woman. I mean, these are like consistent down the line.
That's the story of scroll research for 50 years. But whether the manuscripts came from Jerusalem or the Essenes at Qumran, they are valuable because they give historical context to the first century.
It's not just some question of some Essenes living on the shore of the Dead Sea. It's more significant than that. It shows the thinking of the Jewish people at a crucial moment in their history.
It was a time of monumental events during the first 2 centuries BC and the 1st century AD. The Romans occupied Judea. The Jews were fomenting war. The Second Temple is burned by the Romans in 70 AD. Jerusalem is torched. Several years later, 1,000 Jewish rebels or zealots commit suicide at Herod's Masada fortress rather than surrender to Roman rule. The Jews were crushed. There would be one more revolt between 133 and 135 AD, but they would be defeated by the Romans again. Inside this cauldron of events, the Jewish thinkers were trying to reconcile their beliefs and the law of Moses with the constant disasters they experienced. Much of it is reflected in the sectarian manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Talk of an apocalypse, a final war, messiahs who will come to help.
We have been given a blessing beyond anyone's imagination. We have been given a treasure trove of some 2,500 documents from the past. The ideas here are so awe-inspiring, so uplifting, so poetically beautiful that you actually sometimes stand speechless before the creativity of these people. I mean, these are unique, beautiful ideas, and you can see what Christianity came out of.
That's why the search for new scrolls continues on the outside of Qumran. And inside the words themselves.
So you think we got a good read there?
Richard Reeves and his son David operate the ground-penetrating radar.
That's just perfect. That's perfect.
The paper trail to find Christianity in the Dead Sea
About
Scrolls.
to hit pay dirt, maybe.
Next. It has not been an easy dig. The ground-penetrating radar indicated a possible cave here, but they haven't found it.
Do you have anything that shows the probe that we've been digging through? It's very hard marl. It's much harder than we thought. It's not just limestone and mud. It seems like almost granite when they chip away at it. It's taken them quite a number of days to do that.
They've probed about 8 feet with no opening yet, and the dirt is like a waterfall. It's caused a problem. The GPR has swung into a crack and they'll have to pry it loose. But accidents sometimes lead to discovery. While he's down there, he sees a small hole, the best lead so far. The team will check it out.
It looked like some empty area of some kind?
It could have been. It was near the end of the scan, probably the last half of the first two scans.
So something that might have had the appearance of a void area.
The first scholars appreciated the valuable asset for Judaism, but they wanted to learn more about what the scrolls said about Christianity. They began to match language that was similar between the New Testament, the Christian Gospels, and the manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
In the early church, as it's described in the book of Acts, all the first followers of Jesus handed over their property to the group to take care of any financial needs people might have. We know of this for only one other group, which is the group that was associated with the scrolls. Upon joining the group, one had to hand over one's private property so that there were no distinctions of wealth.
Robert Eisenman finds similarities from the Damascus document, whose fragments were traced from caves 4, 5, and 6, with language in the New Testament that deals with casting out nets.
In the New Testament, the nets are always nets with the apostles or tossing out into the sea, nets with lots of fishes in them, fisherman imagery and so on. But here the nets have to do with Belial, the devil's net. So again, you get slight parallels that may or may not be related. In my view, they're all related.
Whether any of the followers of Jesus read the scrolls, we don't know. But what we can say is that the kind of language we find in the scrolls, a number of the ideas we find in the scrolls, show up in the New Testament. Some of the same phrases occur, like the group of the scrolls refer to themselves as the sons of light and talk about their opponents as the sons of darkness. And those very phrases are used in the New Testament.
The Essenes wrote in the scrolls that God had divided humanity into two camps. They were the sons of light. Those outside their community were referred to as the sons of darkness, to be avoided as unclean. These were the various enemies of the Essenes, perhaps temple priests, perhaps Paul the Christian, perhaps Romans, or anyone who didn't live strictly by Moses' law. Jesus refers to the sons of light in Luke 16:1-9, saying the sons of this world are more clever in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Since Jesus preached a universal love toward sinners, he seems to be criticizing the Essenes for their way of life, shunning all sinners. Eisenman cites another such phrase, the New Covenant, found in the scrolls, and the cup of the New Covenant found in the blood of Christ at the Last Supper in the New Testament.
If you go over to the passages at the Last Supper where Jesus talks about the cup of the New Covenant in his blood, he says, drink this, mashek in damashek. So there is a definite relationship here between the play on the words of Damascus and what's going on in the gospel between the cup of blood of the Pauline version.
The Pauline version is Paul's version of Christianity in its evangelical form, when he took it to Greece and Rome and changed Christianity from a strictly Jewish religion into a universal religion which accepted Gentiles. But the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that the roots of Christianity are definitely Jewish.
Ideas in the scrolls which have some bearing on ideas in the early Christian texts clearly belonged to the ancient Jews. The early Christians were Jews, were they not? And they certainly imbibed the culture, including the literary culture, and the thinking of the people amongst whom they lived and with whom they mingled.
That's what the scrolls have revealed, that at best, Christianity borrowed ideas, concepts, and writing from the manuscripts, but then evolved into something quite different than Judaism. Another example, the Way in the Wilderness language.
Both groups adopted the prophecy of Isaiah. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. In the scrolls, that passage is applied to the community to explain why they were where they were out in the Judean wilderness, leading us to think that they went there to await the arrival of God. In the New Testament, of course, it is applied to John the Baptist in all four of the Gospels, explaining that he was the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord.
Eisenman makes a stronger case than others for a link between the scrolls and Christianity.
And I think anyone who reads this document will see that the points of Christianity are here one after the other. Baptism, immersion in rivers, purification of the body, Holy Spirit baptism of the soul, cleansing of the soul before that, making a way in the wilderness, but the way it has to do with the laws commanded by Moses.
The language was similar, but the context changed as Christianity evolved.
I think that's a helpful way of viewing the early church. They were a Jewish group. It changed later on, of course, but because they were Jewish, they knew these sorts of traditions. They knew the similar language and used it as they attempted to express their own theology.
Almost all the ideas of John the Baptist are in this document. I don't say John the Baptist wrote this, but he is certainly preaching things that are almost virtually parallel. And so I have to date this by internal evidence, early 1st century, not 2nd century BC.
Christians believe John the Baptist was preaching about Jesus coming as the Messiah. But the scrolls talk about a Messiah in a different way.
It's called the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. And it all outlines a whole general apocalyptic battle plan of a messianic, apocalyptic, quasi-monastic, at least certainly fairly celibate in terms of observing purity regulations while on a holy war situation. And it outlines how this war was going to be fought by a community clearly of holy warriors, completely dedicated, lifelong Nazarites, it seems, people who were abstaining from various foods and basic sexual activities, impure relations of different kinds, how they were going to form together in a holy army and invite the heavenly host, led by the Messiah, to come down and fight with them in this final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth.
Some Bible scholars interpret language like that as a prediction of the future, but most Dead Sea scholars believe it was a description of current events, of battling an occupying army, the Romans, and how they could reconcile the turmoil they faced with their God. The Scrolls' Messiah movement makes no mention of Jesus, but it lays the groundwork.
In the case of the Qumran scrolls, we have evidence that they expected two Messiahs to come. One who would be a descendant of David and one who would be a priest. In the New Testament, of course, Jesus is the Messiah, descended from David, as the gospel genealogies indicate to us. But he also has priestly aspects, especially in the book of Hebrews.
The Gospels, written after the Jewish revolt, placed Jesus in the Messiah role. The Dead Sea Scrolls were talking about something else.
It shows how they struggled, and there's something in that struggle for all of us to take with us. A struggle of a people looking for a just way, a right way in life, a good way. It's not so easy, and one has to struggle for his ideals. And you find that struggle in the scrolls.
While ground-penetrating radar is searching for new caves which might hold more Dead Sea Scrolls, other modern tools are being used to find the secrets inside the scrolls. The first task is always to preserve the evidence. The scribes wrote on animal skins called parchment and paper made of papyrus fibers. Some archaeologists believe Qumran housed a scriptorium where scribes or writers worked at long tables. Although some of the 2,000-year-old manuscripts are in remarkable shape, thousands of other fragments are not. Deep in the basement offices of the Israel Museum, 3 scientists work like neurosurgeons to save the fragments. One task is to correct the mistakes of early editors who taped the fragments together with ordinary adhesive tape. They must now remove the glue from the delicate fragments in order to preserve them.
We don't use such materials now, so it should be removed. But before this, I have to make a temporarily done reinforcement from the right inside.
The animal skin or parchment still holds its strength as it has for 2 millennia, but plant fibers are beginning to deteriorate on the papyrus. In order to read what has been written on them, they must be restored.
Papyrus is done from some layers of plant, and now these layers are separated. And I should to glue these layers together.
These women have been working here for 10 years. Restoration has been continuous since the manuscripts were discovered 50 years ago. If the goal is to be able to see what's written, the next step is to be able to know what it means. That requires solving the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle.
So this is the test for Kilamuva. Remember, there was like a scorch mark in the stone.
Bruce Zuckerman is associate professor at the University of Southern California. His team has developed software to clean up the hard-to-read texts.
A lot of times, in Dead Sea Scrolls, as in other ancient inscriptions, whole issues of history and of religion and of you name it can turn on the proper reading of a single letter. So if you read that letter well, you can change history.
Professor Zuckerman often finds himself shadowing the hand of a 2,000-year-old writer. In one text, he found a gap where the scribe had erased letters and left it blank. It was from the book of Job.
Clearly someone came in, scribe at some point, and he erased the text. You can see little traces of it left, but he erased it. He may have copied something twice. After all, this is a document that he's not making up. He's copying it from an original. And so, since this is a book of Job, and I know what ought to be put in here, what I did is I decided to see if I could borrow letters from elsewhere in the scribe's own hand and superimpose them to see if they would work in the gaps.
The phrase reads in Aramaic, according to the way of a man, from the book of Job. Moving through the text in the line above, Zuckerman finds another erasure.
He wrote this letter and he wrote it again. And this time he scratched it out this way, see, because it was... So one of the things I wanted to see is what letters would work. And so I just took this letter here and I made a second copy of it. And that's what I think he scratched out there. By superimposing letters from one place, let's say it's in a scribe's hand, and putting them on top of an area where you're not clear what it reads, and suddenly say, there it is, there's the end. I can see it now. You know, some little thing that will suddenly give you the connection.
It's a different kind of examination, being able to see inside the scrolls and put together letters, even fill in gaps. He tries to know what the scribe was thinking.
There's really no ink here. There's a break where the ink was, but the break is very characteristic. It's not just a break, it's a break with a particular shape to it. So when you look at it, you say, well, what would have caused that? And then you say, well, that's what would have caused that. And since that happens to be what you expect to be there, it's somewhat helpful. Sometimes I imagine that I and my colleagues are standing around a big round table, and we are working on 700 jigsaw puzzles, and the jigsaw puzzles have about 10,000 pieces, but they're all jumbled together.
It's far more than a game. Through his computer work, Professor Zuckerman is shining light on dark areas of the scrolls, opening up new words and new understanding.
See, we have here a place where there's a gap between one fragment and another, and we use a case where we can sort of fill in the gap, where we call it patching, where you make a little patch. We make it very clear where we change things. We could hide all this, so it would look very nice and look perfect. But looking perfect is a bit dangerous when you have a situation like this. It's not exactly what you want to do.
Infrared light beams have been used to trace forgeries in masterpiece paintings, and sometimes to see when the masters changed their minds and painted over a mistake. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's also being used to see through layers of dirt, which has accumulated over the ages.
I would never have guessed that these were letters until I saw them here. But only after you've seen it in the infrared do you really see it. Looking at two sets of writing, one on top of the other, see? And that's actually because I'm looking from one surface of the skin to the back of the other surface of the skin. But in infrared, you can look right through like it was X-ray.
One of the scrolls was made of copper. It was unusual. Where 25% of the other manuscripts were copies of sacred books, the subject of years of study, this was a treasure map with directions literally on where gold and silver are buried.
No one has announced discovery of the treasures. The treasures are in 60 different places. What you'll find there is another copy of this document with its interpretation. Now, my theory is that there are two documents, and that they're like a lock and a key, and that you need both of them to figure out where the treasure is.
Perhaps the treasure doesn't even exist. Many have followed the directions but came up empty. That's why it continues to fascinate. So why was it among the sacred writings? It's not the only mystery in the scrolls. Many of the references to place and people are written in code, which the scholars have had to figure out. It's just one more hurdle at what the scrolls really mean. Coming up. Those who look to the Dead Sea Scrolls as the origin of Christianity face yet one more hurdle. To make the world's biggest puzzle even harder, there are very few names written there, which means there is no mention of Jesus. The scribes used code words.
Almost always the scrolls refer to peoples or to individuals under ciphers or epithets, sometimes involving plays on words to refer to them. So it's not always obvious to whom they're referring. We wish that they wouldn't just say teacher of righteousness or wicked priest for his opponent, but would tell us who they were.
Here you've got, instead of God's name, they put 4 little dots for God's name. This actually says, the Lord spoke unto Moses.
Professor Eisenman believes they used the code words to protect themselves from persecution.
Since they don't identify people by name, they can at least say, well, we weren't talking about that. I mean, it might not help them in the end, but they can at least make that claim.
Interesting phrases appear throughout the scrolls. Teacher of righteousness, the evil priest, Katim. While Christians are quick to think of Jesus or John the Baptist in those terms, historians don't think they apply. More likely, the scribes were describing their own enemies or problems rather than grand ideas. As an example, the teacher of righteousness is thought to be the founder of the Essenes. The wicked priest, someone they don't agree with, who is teaching a different message. But not Christianity.
There's no compelling evidence to show that. There's no smoking scroll out there that allows you to say, aha, this is clearly a scroll that was a seminal influence on Jesus, or Jesus was there and he influenced them, or they were there and they influenced Jesus or Peter or any of the other early Christians.
That is the consensus of the scholars. But the consensus also feels the true value of the scrolls is the history it provides of a people during a time of great unrest. There were 2 Jewish uprisings against Roman occupations in Palestine. Twice the Jews were defeated. The sacred Temple of Solomon burned.
No one who resisted Rome was allowed to survive. The Romans hunted down everybody, including Masada.
Masada is symbolic of what happened to those who fought the Romans. A small group of 1,000 Jewish zealots held off the Roman army for 1 year and then committed suicide rather than become slaves to the Romans.
The only groups that did survive were the Pauline Christians, who claim also to be Pharisee to start with, though they portray themselves as being against the Pharisees in the Gospels and in the figure of their Jesus as they present him in a Paulinized way.
He's referring to the Christian church of Paul, who was converted around the time Jesus was crucified. Eisenman feels this is the Christianity we know today, which evolved from the Jewish groups that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Paul knows this group. Paul was trained in this group. All his vocabulary reflects his training by this group. He obviously must have had a falling out with this group. As Paul and others like him took this material overseas in a Greco-Hellenistic Roman world, it went 180 degrees into the kind that we're more familiar with, absorbing the elements of Greek mystery religion where it was useful, like the Osiris cult. After all, Isis is almost like the name Jesus.
Well, Christianity certainly did change as its membership became primarily non-Jewish, so that Jewish traditions in it became less important. That was the basis, that was the foundation that was present, and it's not entirely disappeared from Christianity. But changes did occur, and different ways of thinking and interpreting became more important. But it grew from a Jewish base.
They left us this treasure trove, this time capsule behind them. None could come back because they were all exterminated, but they left their documents, and we are the fortunate ones in the 20th and 21st century to have discovered them. And now we can do some real history.
The dig is reaching an unsuccessful conclusion.
Is it on this finger or this finger?
I think it's on that
If you go in there, Tom, you may become the most famous person on the planet for 2 days.
If you go in there, you'll become famous if there's something in there.
There probably are more scrolls in other caves, but this expedition has not found them.
Let's pack it in, wait in the morning.
It's like sort of playing blind man's bluff because we don't know if we're too low or too high, and the chipping away is so difficult that we can't ask the workmen to do any more than they're doing. They may have dug the hole too low or too high or whatever, but it was an attempt to probe physically what you were seeing on this radar scan, and we did the best we could because the work was extremely hard and time-consuming and tiring. I can't imagine how hard those cliffs were.
The real exploration will continue inside the manuscripts and fragments themselves, using forensic technology to search for new words hidden in the animal skins.
Lost my place here.
And driving it all, indeed, is a passion. To find answers by searching for the origins of religion. Why? In a modern world of space travel and DNA, the real question is how to resolve how we live with what a 2,000-year-old religion tells us to believe.